Colorado, 2038. Snow drifted in heavy sheets across the slate roof of an old stone chapel. Inside, the glow of candles flickered against the framed portrait of Thomas Cole, the man who had built coal industries from nothing, a pioneer in clean water technology, a name that once carried weight. Ethan Cole, 32, pushed the heavy wooden door open. His coat still smelled faintly of lab chemicals. He had come for silence, for a solemn memorial to honor the only man who had ever believed in him. But silence was nowhere to be found. Instead, laughter. From the front pew, his mother's voice, sharp and cutting, carried through the incense-thick air. "He's never accomplished anything worth remembering. All those years buried in his little lab, a waste." The chuckles that followed weren't loud, but they were enough. A few relatives nodded along, some shaking their heads as if she had simply stated a fact. Ethan's chest tightened. He stared at the portrait of his grandfather, the man who once called him the quiet one with a mind for the future. But now, not a single person rose to defend him. Not even here, not even today. He turned away, jaw locked, unwilling to let anyone see the tremor in his lips. His footsteps echoed down the side hallway toward the old study where his grandfather had spent countless nights. The door stood ajar. A thin strip of yellow light spilled across the floor. Ethan hesitated, then pushed it open. The room smelled of varnished wood and paper gone brittle with age. On the oak desk, papers lay scattered, but one document sat neatly on top as if waiting for him. Coal Industries Transfer Agreement. Ethan froze, his pulse pounded as he stepped closer. At the bottom of the page, in bold black ink, Thomas Cole's signature. His hand shook as he touched the page. Impossible. He had shoveled earth onto his grandfather's grave 3 months ago, and yet here under flickering light was his name, ink fresh and deliberate. The room tilted. Ethan steadied himself against the desk. His grandfather's handwriting, once steady, bold, was here reduced to something thinner, shakier, close enough to fool an eager eye, far enough to betray the truth. It wasn't just a lie. It was a theft. Someone had forged the dead man's hand and sold off the beating heart of their family. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. In his cramped apartment, the single desk lamp cast harsh shadows as he pored over the contract again and again. His eyes burned, but he refused to look away. The lines, the phrasing, the signature itself, all of it screamed false. Not sloppy, no, carefully calculated, designed to be just convincing enough for anyone willing to believe. And that was the cruelest part. Someone in his family had wanted it to be believed. As snow buried the city outside, Ethan sat alone with the contract, a single thought searing itself into his mind. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a declaration of war. The snow was still falling when Ethan's laptop screen lit his apartment in pale blue. Coffee went cold beside him, forgotten. He wasn't looking for sleep anymore, he was looking for truth. He pulled up the corporate filings, the digital archives Thomas had once guarded like scripture. The deeper he dug, the uglier it became. At first, small irregularities. Amendments slipped into coal industries' bylaws, votes signed off by proxy without his grandmother Helen's consent. Then bank transfers, offshore accounts bleeding money out of the company like an open wound. And at the center of every single trail, 2 names emerged again and again. Victor Cole, Marissa Cole, his uncle and his mother. Ethan leaned back, bile rising in his throat. It wasn't just greed. This was premeditated, orchestrated. They had hollowed out his grandfather's company like termites eating through beams, waiting for the structure to collapse so they could sell off the remains. And who were they selling it to? Ethan's cursor hovered over a contract draft buried in an encrypted folder. He cracked it open, pulse hammering. The buyer, Andes Extractives International. He knew the name. Everyone in environmental engineering did. The mining conglomerate with a history of poisoned rivers in Chile, toxic tailings in Peru, entire villages left unlivable. They didn't buy companies to protect them. They bought them to strip them bare. Coal Industries, a firm founded to clean water, was being sold to the very people who destroyed it. Ethan's jaw locked so tight it hurt. His grandfather had fought politicians, outlived competitors, stared down entire industries to protect that mission. And now, his own blood was selling it out for profit. But the knife twisted deeper still. Among the documents, Ethan found a medical release form, his grandmother Helen's signature, shaky, uncertain, authorizing assisted living care. Attached were guardianship papers transferring her voting rights to Victor. Ethan's breath caught. He remembered the way Helen's hands trembled, the softness of her voice, the fire still in her eyes even in old age. She had always been sharp, decisive, far from someone who would willingly surrender control. They hadn't just pushed her aside. They had erased her. Ethan closed his eyes, fists clenched on the desk. His mother's mocking words from the chapel replayed in his head. He's never accomplished anything worth remembering. And suddenly he understood. She had meant it, every word, because to Marissa the legacy wasn't about water or integrity or family. It was about power, and she would burn every bridge, even her son, to hold it. The realization hit him like a blade. This wasn't just Victor's scheme. His own mother had stood beside him, pen in hand. And if they could betray Helen, if they could forge Thomas's hand, if they could laugh while Ethan sat in the pews, dismissed as nothing, then they had already chosen sides. Not his, not ever. The city slept, but Ethan didn't. Nights bled into mornings as his apartment turned into a war room. Papers spread across the floor, coffee mugs stacking up like bullet casings, his laptop screens glowing with documents nobody else was supposed to see. For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't just analyzing data, he was hunting with it. And then, piece by piece, he began to find his weapons. The contract scan. The forged transfer agreement was his first clue. But Ethan needed more than suspicion. He needed proof that could stand in daylight. So he ran the signature through a forensic AI scanner, the kind he had helped design for environmental compliance. On the screen, the results lit up like crime scene markers. Ink particle analysis, batch inconsistencies, microscopic signatures from a printer model released just 6 months earlier. Thomas Cole's pen had been a Mont Blanc fountain always. This signature, toner spray from a machine that didn't even exist while he was alive. The contract wasn't just fake, it was scientifically, irrefutably fake. The land files. Digging deeper into Victor's encrypted folders, Ethan uncovered something darker. Environmental reports hidden under layers of password protection. He cracked them open and froze. Whole tracts of Cole family land, poisoned. Chemical runoff bleeding into rivers, carcinogens seeping into groundwater. Fields turned to barren dirt under Victor's watch. It wasn't incompetence. It was cover-up. Victor had been preparing to legalize the contamination before the sale, burying decades of corruption before Andy's extractives took over. Photos of dead fish, blackened streams, cracked soil spread across Ethan's screen. Proof that Coal Industries was about to be sold with its soul already rotting. The testament. In a dusty leather binder marked with his grandfather's initials, Ethan found something no one else had known existed. A sealed memorandum, handwritten and notarized. His grandfather's words, simple and deliberate. Should fraud or betrayal ever touch this company, my grandson Ethan Cole is granted full succession rights. Legacy belongs to those who protect it, not those who exploit it. Ethan's hand shook as he traced the lines. For years, he had been the family afterthought, the lab rat who never measured up. Yet here, hidden away, was the truth, Thomas had always known the storm would come, and he had chosen Ethan as the contingency plan. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at him, but for the first time in days, a smile broke across his face. Victor and Marissa thought he was just the quiet one, the forgotten grandson, the man who buried himself in data while they played Empire. But now the data was his weapon. The contract scan, the poisoned land files, the testament. Together, they weren't just evidence. They were an arsenal. And when the time came, he would bring them into the light, not in whispers, not in private, but in front of the entire world. The boardroom had been transformed into a theater. Glass walls overlooked the snowy skyline of Denver, but inside the chamber the lights were hot, cameras flashing as reporters filled every seat. Screens displayed the coal industry's logo beside that of Andes Extractives International, a marriage of opposites, dressed up as destiny. At the center, Victor Cole commanded the stage. His white suit gleamed under the spotlights, his smile rehearsed to perfection. Beside him, Marissa adjusted the clasp of her pearl necklace, radiating the calm of someone who thought she had already won. "This is the future of coal industries." Victor boomed into the microphones, his voice bouncing off glass and steel. "A bold partnership that will carry us into the next century." Polite applause rolled across the room. Investors leaned forward with pens ready. The Andes executives smiled like wolves. The cameras zoomed in as Victor reached for the contract. And then, the back doors slammed open. Every head turned. Ethan Cole walked in. No entourage, no fanfare, just the soft echo of his shoes on marble. His posture steady, his gaze locked forward. A man everyone had dismissed, now stepping straight into the fire. The room hushed, murmurs rippling like electricity. Reporters shifted in their seats, sensing the kind of moment that turns into headlines. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. He crossed the floor with deliberate steps, walked past the cluster of executives, and connected his tablet to the massive display wall behind the stage. The screens flickered, then lit up. The first blow, the forged signature. Side-by-side overlays filled the wall, Thomas Cole's authentic signature against the forgery. A forensic AI breakdown highlighted every inconsistency, every tremor, every trace of ink from a printer that didn't exist when Thomas was alive. Gasps erupted across the room. Reporters scrambled for their notepads. Victor's smile faltered. The second blow, the poisoned land. Photos replaced the signatures, barren fields, blackened streams, soil glowing with chemical residue under UV light. The hidden land files flashed across the screen, revealing years of contamination buried under falsified reports. Investors surged to their phones, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Marissa's pearls rattled against her collarbone as her hand twitched. The final blow, Helen's voice. The screen cut to video. Helen Cole appeared frail but resolute in a wheelchair. Her voice trembled, but her words landed like iron. "I was stripped of my rights by my own family, erased on paper, forgotten in a nursing home, but I am still here, and the only one who stood by me was my grandson." The silence was absolute. Cameras recorded every second, live stream feeds exploding with comments. Victor's hand froze above the contract, pen hovering uselessly in midair. "This isn't your stage, Ethan," Victor snapped, his voice low but trembling. "You don't belong in this room." But Ethan didn't flinch. He stood before the cameras, calm and unyielding, no longer the quiet grandson. In that instant, everyone watching understood. The forgotten heir had just turned the signing ceremony into a trial. The boardroom was chaos. Reporters shouted over one another. Cameras flashed like strobe lights. Investors stormed for the exits with phones pressed to their ears. Victor raised his voice above the din, pounding his fist on the table. "This means nothing," he barked, sweat gleaming on his temple. Digital tricks, an old woman's shaky words. None of it holds in court. Marissa stepped in, her voice smoother, almost maternal, the tone she once used on Ethan as a boy. "Sweetheart, you're embarrassing yourself," she said through gritted teeth. "Walk away before you destroy what little reputation you have left." The crowd hushed, waiting to see if Ethan would crack. But Ethan stood silent, steady, the storm gathering in his eyes. And then the doors at the back swung open once more. Gasps rippled across the room. Helen Cole appeared. Her frame was frail, her hands trembling on the armrests of her wheelchair, but her presence filled the chamber like thunder. Two aides guided her forward, each push of the chair echoing against marble floors. The room fell utterly still. Victor's face drained of color. Marissa clutched her pearls so tightly it looked like she might snap the strand. Helen's eyes, clear, steel blue despite her years, swept across the hall. She saw the cameras, the board members, the vultures from Andy's. And then, finally, she looked at Ethan. Her hand rose, unsteady but certain, and she pointed to him. Her voice cracked at first, but then carried impossibly strong, amplified not by microphones but by truth. "The only one who has kept his promise to this family is the grandson you tried to erase." A collective breath sucked in across the room. Reporters surged forward, lenses zooming in, capturing every detail of the moment that would replay on news feeds for decades. Victor stumbled for words. "Mother, this isn't..." Helen's gaze cut him down. "You forged your father's name. You buried our land in poison. You silenced me, locked me away. But Ethan..." Her lips trembled into the faintest smile. Ethan remembered what legacy is. The Andes executives shifted uncomfortably, their perfect smiles gone. The live-stream comment feeds exploded with outrage, sympathy, and shock. And in that silence, one undeniable truth crystallized for everyone watching. Victor and Marissa weren't just corrupt. They weren't just thieves. They were traitors to their own blood. And now the blood they tried to erase had returned, carried by the matriarch herself to crown her true heir. The boardroom teetered on the edge of riot. Reporters pressed forward, microphones thrust into the air. Investors shouted at each other over the din, some demanding answers, others fleeing for the exits. Victor's voice thundered above it all, desperate, cracking with rage. "This is slander. This is nothing but theatrics." He pointed a trembling hand at Ethan. "You are nothing. You've always been nothing. A washed-up grandson hiding in a lab. You don't get to decide what legacy means." Every camera caught the spit on his lips, the sweat rolling down his cheek, the madness in his eyes. Ethan didn't move. He didn't shout back. He simply raised his hand. The screens lit again. Numbers, transfers, offshore accounts spider-webbing across the globe. Forged audits, wire logs, proof of funds siphoned away in the dead of night. The crowd fell silent as the spreadsheets scrolled on, damning in their precision. Ethan's voice was even, steady, every word slicing through the quiet like glass. "Everything you've stolen is here, every dollar traced, every signature forged, and it's already in the hands of federal investigators." The last line hit like a hammer, and right on cue the glass doors burst open. Two federal agents strode in, flanked by uniformed officers. Their badges glinted under the lights. "Victor Cole, Marissa Cole," one agent announced, his voice firm, unshakable. "You are under arrest for fraud, forgery, and corporate conspiracy." Gasps tore through the room. Cameras swiveled, flashes exploding as officers pushed past stunned executives. Marissa shrieked as the handcuffs closed around her wrists, pearls scattering across the marble floor like broken promises. "Wait, you can't do this, we're family," she cried, clawing toward Ethan. Victor's face twisted red, veins straining against his skin as agents forced his arms behind his back. "You can't erase me," he roared. "You're nothing without us, do you hear me? Nothing." Ethan stepped forward, calm as winter steel. The cameras turned to him, the entire world watching for his reply. His gaze locked on Victor, no hatred, no pity, only finality. Legacy isn't about blood, Ethan said coldly. It's about who protects it. The words landed heavier than any gavel. Reporters scribbled furiously, live streams lit up with firestorm comments, and investors who once doubted now stared in silence at the man they had overlooked. The handcuffs clicked shut. Victor and Marissa were dragged through the gauntlet of flashing cameras, their empire collapsing in front of millions of eyes. And in the center of the storm, Ethan Cole stood unshaken, no longer the forgotten grandson, but the rightful heir, the guardian of the name they tried to steal. 1 year later, the smoke-stained factories were gone. The poisoned fields had been dug out, cleansed, and transformed. Where chemical sludge once choked the earth, wetlands now thrived with reeds and birdsong. Rows of solar panels shimmered in the Colorado sun, feeding power into new water reclamation plants. Coal Industries, the company Victor and Marissa tried to sell for parts, had become something else entirely. A beacon of sustainable engineering, a model every journalist now called the comeback no one saw coming. Employees who once feared layoffs now returned with pride, their families lining up at the gates during open house weekends. Investors who had turned their backs now begged for shares. And at the center of it all, Ethan Cole, not the forgotten grandson, not the lab rat mocked in whispers, but the architect of a resurrection. Helen's return. In the ancestral Cole estate, the old halls were alive again. Fresh paint on the walls, portraits of past generations restored, the garden blooming outside the wide windows. And in her chair by the window, Helen Cole sat not in exile, but at home. Her laughter drifted across the garden as she held Ethan's arm, watching children run across the lawn where silence once reigned. She had been written off, erased on paper, but now she was back, the living matriarch of a legacy reborn. The monument. On the anniversary of Thomas Cole's passing, Ethan stood in the atrium of the new headquarters. Reporters gathered, cameras rolling. At the center of the hall stood a monument, a slab of polished stone etched with words Ethan had once discovered in a hidden memorandum. Legacy belongs to those who protect it, not those who exploit it. The crowd hushed. A reporter called out, "Mr. Cole, what does this mean to you after everything?" Ethan's eyes lifted to the carving. His voice was steady, certain. "Blood gave me a name, but honor gave me the right to carry it forward." The cameras clicked. The world listened. And in that moment, the Cole legacy became untouchable, not because of wealth, not because of inheritance, but because one man refused to let it be stolen. The grandson they laughed at, the son they dismissed, the heir they tried to erase, now stood as the one who carried everything.